In this podcast, you'll learn about cancel culture and what it means to be woke. Now, before you listen to this episode, here is a trigger warning. And trigger warning is one of those expressions you'll learn today. The views expressed in this podcast are 100% the opinions and beliefs of me, Reza, and my friend Craig. We take full responsibility
for any unintentional offence we may cause in this podcast. Welcome to
Aprender Inglés with Reza and Craig.
Hello and welcome, especially if you're a new listener to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you. My name's Craig.
And my name's Reza.
And with 50 years of teaching between us, we're going to help you improve your English and take it to the next level. How are you, Reza? It's been a while since we've spoken on the podcast.
It has been a while since we've spoken. It's also been a while since I've had a decent meal, but that's been remedied by Craig today. We had a very nice lunch here at his flat before we started podcasting, so I'm really in the mood to get going.
Yeah, it's lovely to be podcasting again with you again. But of course, for you listening out there, you may think, well, what are they talking about? We heard these guys last week. Yes, we do record these podcasts in a batch of 3, and then we publish them. But we haven't actually recorded together for about 5 weeks. So we've had a lovely break. We've been on holiday and we're back ready to podcast and help you with your English. What's first, Reza?
Let's get cracking with a voice message all the way from the southern hemisphere. From Argentina, we have Gaston.
Hello, it's Gaston from Argentina. Well, first of all, thank you for replying to one of my questions some weeks ago. And I wanted to ask you another thing. So I have recently passed the B2 first. And, at the moment, I'm not taking English lessons. Hopefully by April or May, I'm going to take lessons. But at the moment, I can't do that. Because I think I'm going to do that by April or May. But at the moment, I can't. So that's why I wanted to ask you this. Sometimes I have some free time and I want to practice something. I want to practice something in relation to the C1 advanced level. But I don't know how to do that, what book to use. So that's why I wanted to ask you, do you know some book which, enables students to practice on their own for the C1 advanced level? Of course, it's always better to prepare the level with a teacher, and hopefully I will do that, but at the moment I can't. So that's why, sometimes I want to practice and I don't know how, I don't know what book to use. And well, thank you very much and have a nice Sunday.
Well, thank you very much, Gaston. It's lovely to hear from you again. And congratulations on passing your B2 first exam. That is absolutely fantastic news, isn't it, Reza?
It is. But it doesn't surprise me that you passed because you have such fantastic pronunciation. Don't you think, Craig?
Yes, very good vowel sounds, very good stress when you're speaking. A little bit of hesitating, a little bit of what I've just done, Gaston, hesitating, but not too much so that it gets uncomfortable. Your pronunciation is really very, very good. And I think it's a wonderful idea that you're going to continue to study for the C1 advanced exam. Well done.
Yes, certainly in terms of pronunciation, you won't have any problems. And you asked us to recommend some books. Well, one book I would highly recommend, I'm sure Craig would agree with me, is Complete CAE, that's Certificate in Advanced English, student's book. Better if you get it with the answers so you can correct yourself, and the CD-ROM that goes with it, by our ex-colleague from the British Council a few years ago in Valencia, Guy Brookhart and Simon Haynes. Do you know that book?
Yes, yeah, of course I remember Guy. We worked with him for a few years, but that's not the reason we're recommending a book that he co-wrote. We think it's a very good book for self-study and for group study in a classroom with a teacher, but it's very useful to study by yourself, Gaston. So I will put a link to that book in the show notes. You can see that if you go to inglespodcast.com/465. And there's another book that we'd recommend, isn't there, Reza?
Yes, if you want to concentrate on practicing the exam in its actual format. So the book we've just mentioned is more to learn English useful for the exam, as well as some exam practice. But if you want a book specifically just to practice the tests in the format of the exam, we'd recommend Advanced Trainer, which has 6 practice tests. Buy it with the answer key, and the audio. Usually these days, the audio comes via a link which you find on the inside cover. Make sure that you got access to the audio to practice the listening. So Advanced Trainer, published by Cambridge, is excellent for getting to know the strategy behind doing the actual exam type questions and then practicing them in the format you'll find them in.
And that link will also, Gaston, be in the show notes. And when you are ready to take the exam, if you'd like to prepare and practice with me for the speaking, that is something I offer. You can have preparation classes with me for the speaking test if you feel you need it. And that's true for anybody out there who is preparing for a job interview or to take a Cambridge exam or to give a presentation at work, that kind of thing. I do offer short-term preparation classes for those kind of goals and objectives. Next, we have another voice message from another friend of the show, and that's Alexander from Ukraine.
Hello everybody, this is Alex who lives in Segovia province. In the podcast where Craig interviewed the kangaroo man, he asked about motivation. Personally for me, it's never been an issue, and I can't understand how can you lack motivation if you're doing something really interesting. As additional motivation, you can use exams. For example, during the last pandemic, I've got TEFL certificate. And now I'm aiming at CPE. Regarding getting stuck, I think it's quite natural to get stuck from time to time if you've been doing something for quite a while. So here, I think the best way is to try to get out of your comfort zone and try new things. For instance, recently I've studied recording myself, and I think it's the best way to practice your speaking skills if you don't live in a country where the language is spoken, because you can listen to your recording, analyze your speech, improve something, and re-record yourself again and again until you make it almost perfect.
Yes, I definitely agree, Alexander. Recording your voice on your phone or on a similar device is a wonderful way for improving your fluency. Listen back, try and improve it, and you can start by sending us a message. We'll give you details of how to do that at the end of the podcast. And sending us a voice message like Gaston did and Alexander, it's a wonderful way of practicing and preparing your speaking for when you actually are speaking face-to-face with a native speaker.
Yes, I agree exactly with Craig and with Alexander that you record yourself time and time again and then compare your earlier recordings with your later recordings, and hopefully you will see that you're improving. It's a very motivating thing to do and a very practical thing to do because you will actually literally hear your progress.
Exactly. And Alexander's comments about motivation, he's referring to a podcast I did with Christian from Kangaroo English, or Kangaroo English, as Alexander said, the kangaroo man. And if you want to listen to that podcast, go to inglespodcast.com/457 and you'll hear Christian and I having a conversation about motivation and how to get it back if you're losing your motivation as far as your English studies are concerned.
We're going to go back to the Southern Hemisphere again, but not Argentina, this time to Australia, but via Brazil, so very much in the Southern Hemisphere. We have an email from Honorio, who is a Brazilian guy, but he lives in Australia.
Yes, and this refers directly to the focus of this week's podcast, wokeism, because here is what Honorio wrote to us. He says, in a recent episode on pet peeves, inglespodcast.com/461, I agree with you on many of them, but what caught my attention was your mention of wokeism and the fact that you are planning to make an episode about it. Not planning on audio, we're actually doing it today, so there you are. And he continues, I don't like wokeism, and I've been criticizing it for a long time. I've been discussing with friends, with family and colleagues. I'm far from being an expert on the subject, and my arguments are mostly reflections of my feelings about the damage that wokeism has been causing in society and in relationships with other people and our freedom. So quite strong words there from Honorio. I'm looking forward to listening to this future podcast, and very brave of you to consider making it.
Yes, I guess you're right in a way, Honorio, because we could become yet another victim of wokeism. People who say something that offends somebody else, couldn't we, Craig?
Yeah, well, let's see if we are cancelled after this episode by any listeners out there as we talk about wokeism. But first, let's describe and define exactly what wokeism is. WOKEISM, to be woke. What does the Collins Dictionary say, Reza?
So I'm quoting now from Collins. The behavior and attitudes of people who are sensitive to social and political injustice.
So that would be like sexism, racism,
homophobia, all that type of thing. If that's you, then you could say that you are woke. That would be the adjective, and the noun wokeism.
That definition was quite neutral. Some definitions in other dictionaries can be quite negative. For example, I found one on dictionary.com. Listen to this. What is wokeism? Usually disparaging, which means something that has no importance or value, little worth. Promotion of liberal, progressive ideology and policy as an expression of sensitivity to systematic injustices and prejudices. For example, she works for nearly a decade at the university before she finally tired of the influence of wokeism. And another example, from the same source, dictionary.com, the only religion allowed around here is wokeism, he complained. Quite a negative definition, don't you think, Reza?
Yeah, that is pretty negative, but I guess plenty of people would agree with it. Well, listeners, are you awake? I'm sure you are, or you wouldn't be listening to this. But are you woke? Well, let's see. Let's talk a little bit more about the word wokeism. So, as I said earlier, woke is the adjective. It's not the same as awake. Awake means you are not sleeping. If you're woke, that's quite different. It's a term which actually goes back quite a while. It comes from the African American, so Black American vernacular, so very particular, colloquial, specific to one group, vernacular English. In that sense, it means originally alert to racial prejudice and discrimination. Now, some people think it dates back to about 2010, but that's not true. It in fact goes back much further than that, but it was around the year 2010, when it became really popular, and now you hear it a lot. But in fact, the word woke in this meaning was first used way back, as far back as at least the 1930s, maybe even the 1920s. So I repeat, it wasn't popularized till 2010, but actually, particularly Black Americans used it in a positive way, not in a negative way, to mean it as a good thing. If you were a Black American who was woke in 1930, you were aware of and alert to, and you knew about the injustices in the system, particularly as regards the treatment of Black Americans.
So although the word woke goes back quite a few years, I think Reza might agree with me that we hadn't really heard that word or become aware of it growing up in the UK in the 80s and 90s. We heard political correctness, or PC. So if you were PC, you were sympathetic to minority groups, you were not sexist, you were not racist, and you didn't offend anybody by your speech. So that was really, really similar, a similar expression for basically the same word, to be politically correct.
Yeah, it's basically the same, isn't it? Although I would say when we were growing up, perhaps not now, but when we were growing up, PC, politically correct, was considered a good thing. It was seen as a positive term. So you had to be PC. But then a point in time arrived when people started to use PC, politically correct, as an ironic term, like you're being a bit annoying by always talking about sexism, racism, etc. Too much. So it started off as a positive term, but it began to be used negatively. And exactly the same is true of woke. So back in the 1930s, it was considered a positive thing, but now people often talk about being woke or wokeism in an ironic way, like to make fun of someone or to say kind of, hey, would you shut up about this justice all the time? It's getting a bit irritating. Would you agree?
Yeah, it's often used sarcastically in some situations these days, and we'll talk about that a bit later and how it is affecting people in society. But first, let's look at some more vocabulary that you might come across as students if you're talking about or reading about or discussing this idea of wokeism. The first expression on the list here is identity politics. And the definition I have is that it's political positions that are based on the social groups that people see themselves as belonging to. Because when we look at ourselves in society, we tend to classify ourselves and other people as belonging to particular religious groups or race or people from a certain class or social background, rather than traditional political parties. So identity politics is kind of an umbrella term for these different political social positions that people have.
Now, we've already spoken about the term politically correct, which we said is quite often used pejoratively. That means to be insulting or to attack someone or to make fun. And it refers to conforming to the latest or the most fashionable, the trendy kind of demands about justice and equality, etc. But we could talk about some specific areas of political correctness. For example, CRT, or critical race theory. So that's a theory. It's a set of ideas, and it holds that racial bias, B-I-A-S, bias means not being fair, is inherent in many parts of Western society. It's part of society. It's inherent, especially in its legal and social institutions, on the basis of their having been primarily designed for and implemented by white people. In other words, since white people invented the legal and social institutions, it's already biased in their favor. That's the idea of critical race theory.
So that would be, for example, an organization like the police having been made up of mostly white people, so maybe inherently or intrinsically racist.
The police, or indeed the whole justice system, people who support CRT would probably point out, how many black judges are there in the UK? And the truth is, not many, although the number is growing. So they would probably use that type of thing as a means of justifying the theory of CRT.
Another expression you might hear is cancel culture. What's cancel culture? Well, it's a phrase that became popular in the late 2010s or early 2020s, used to refer to a culture in which those who are said to have acted or spoken in an unacceptable manner or way are ostracized or excluded from society or from a group. Maybe they're boycotted or shunned, which means avoided, ignored, rejected. To shun somebody, S-H-U-N, to ignore them and reject them.
A bit later, we'll talk about some specific examples, but let's go on for now with our vocabulary. Let's talk about social justice. You could define that as the pursuit of fairness, justice, and equality in society, particularly in terms of access to resources, opportunities, and rights. So all of that could be termed as social justice.
Another term is microaggression. You probably know what the word aggression means, to be aggressive, violent, but microaggressive or microaggression, that's a very subtle, very soft, often unintentional way of discrimination that sends a message or communicates derogatory or negative messages to marginalized groups in society. So it shows a critical, sometimes disrespectful attitude, but it's very, very subtle, and people sometimes don't realize that they're doing it. For example, you might be speaking to a Chinese person who's working in a bar in Spain. Now, here in Valencia, there are many businesses owned by Chinese, and you might say, your Spanish is very good. But then why would you assume that that person would have Spanish as a second language? Maybe they're second or third generation, born in Spain, so they're just as Spanish as somebody else. But you're insinuating or suggesting that they're foreigners from another country and they don't belong here.
Our next word is a word which you'll probably already know, but let's just define it in modern usage. Privilege. By that we mean the unearned, so you didn't earn them, you didn't do anything to get them, you just have them. The unearned advantages or benefits that individuals have due to their social status or identity, such as race, gender, sexuality, or socio-economic status. To put that into practical examples, it's widely believed that if you're a white, older male from an affluent, that means fairly wealthy family, you're going to do all right in life. You already have a certain amount of privilege.
And the next expression is trigger warning, which we had at the beginning of this podcast. We warned you beforehand that maybe we might offend people in this podcast. We hope we don't, but we gave you a trigger warning. What's that? Well, a gun has a trigger. If you fire a gun, you pull the trigger. And the verb to trigger means to start something. So if something we say, or if any content that you hear or see might cause or trigger an emotional negative response for you, then that would be something that you perhaps wanted to be warned about in advance. For example, if you're going to watch on TV discussions of violence or sexual assault or other traumatic experiences, that might trigger a very negative response from you. So that's what a trigger warning is. It's warning you in advance.
The next term is one of my favorites. It's an expression I really like. I find it quite amusing. It's snowflake. Now, the word snowflake is certainly not new. It's been around since the idea of snow. So a snowflake is a snowflake, flake, un copito, un copo, like a cornflake, copito de maíz. So a snowflake is an individual piece of snow, which obviously is a very, very tiny thing. But you probably know that all snowflakes, and there are many billions, are completely unique. No two snowflakes are identical. So the modern use of the word snowflake when we're talking about wokeism or social justice and that type of thing, It's a term which is used ironically for people who are deemed, that means considered, to have an overinflated, so it's too big, an overinflated sense of uniqueness, like each individual snowflake, which is unique, or sense of entitlement, like they have the automatic right to something, or simply are just too easily offended. What people are we talking about? Well, Generation Snowflake. Yes, the term is around. Just like we got Generation X, Millennials, Generation Y, all sorts of things. There's now a Generation Snowflake. And as I speak, that currently refers to people who were born around the years between 1990 and 2005. Yes, I know that refers to quite a few of our listeners, 1990 to 2005. Though that group of people, some of them could be snowflakes, and they're considered by many older people to be basically less resilient, not as tough, not as hard, not as well-formed as previous generations. You got it too easy. You're like a dainty little fragile snowflake. You're so unique, but so fragile. And we older people kind of make fun of you a bit for it. It's like, oh, don't be so soft. You're not a unique snowflake. We've all been there and done that, the things you've had to go through. Pull yourself together and be tough. Don't be a snowflake.
Again, to see these expressions, go to the show notes. We've got them listed there, inglespodcast.com/465. The last expression is greenwash. To greenwash. What is greenwashing? One word. This is when a company or a business goes out of its way, makes a special effort to convince you that it is more environmentally friendly than it really is. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, McDonald's, they changed their plastic straws, their drinking straws to drink with, for paper ones. Ooh, paper straws, very green, better than plastic, you might think. However, it turns out that the thickness of these paper straws made them too difficult to recycle at the time. And of course, don't forget the enormous carbon footprint of McDonald's cows to make their hamburgers. So it's when a company like McDonald's tries to make you think they're very green and environmentally friendly, although really it's just false publicity and it's not true. Greenwash.
I must admit, I do think of greenwashing regularly when I see the weather forecast. And it could be in Spain or the UK. It happens in both countries. You quite often see, and now the weather brought to you by, and to avoid legal problems, I'm not going to say any particular company, but brought to you by the name of an oil company, for example.
Yeah.
The weather brought to you by, insert the name of an oil company. But hold on. Isn't it the oil companies which are helping to change climate? It's kind of ironic that they bring you the weather because they're largely to blame for climate change itself. If we didn't burn so many of those fossil fuels which they produce, we wouldn't have so many problems with the climate. For me, that's a classic case of greenwashing.
Exactly. My sense is they're doing it on purpose. And of course, they want you to associate their brand and their company with doing good things for the environment. It's very clever if you think about it. So keep your eyes open for greenwashing by certain companies. We've got some quotations next on this topic of wokeism. And our first one is by Salman Rushdie, the famous activist and author. And he said, "What is freedom of expression? Without the freedom to offend, it ceases to exist." Do you agree with that?
100%. And certainly no one knows more about it than him. Because as many of you will know, he got into big trouble for publishing a book which some Muslims got offended by and said he should never have published, and a death threat was put out against him. And in fact, a few years back, after many years of avoiding trouble, he was attacked by a crazy fanatic, remember?
It was only a few months ago, I think, or maybe a year. Yeah, he was attacked and stabbed on stage.
So after many, many years of threats, they eventually did get to him, and he was stabbed. So he knows a thing or two about freedom of expression.
We have another quote here from someone that I know you're a big fan of, George Orwell. What did he say?
Well, in fact, I've got a couple of quotes from him. One is, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear.
Freedom of speech.
I put extra emphasis on the word not. Yeah, tell people anything you like, but if you live in a society where you're never hearing what you don't want to hear, you should be very suspicious that you're not hearing the full story.
He also said this quote, what is needed is the right to print what one believes to be true without having to fear bullying or blackmail from any side. So again, freedom of speech, saying what you think without worrying if you're going to offend anybody.
Yeah, but you've got to remember in the historical context, we don't have to go back that far. George Orwell died in 1950, I think. So in the 40s, 30s, anybody who criticized a political movement, even if they were quite sympathetic to it, they were immediately presumed to be of the opposite persuasion. So George Orwell was quite a famous, let's say, lefty, he might be called, in colloquial terms, left-wing. He had quite a lot of sympathies towards certain left-wing ideas, but he despised communism. He really didn't like it at all, but he was very left-wing. So anytime he attacked communism, he was described as a fascist. But he fought in the Spanish Civil War against the fascists. How could he be a fascist? But he criticized Stalin, fascist. So there was a period of time where if you criticized even slightly something that you quite liked, they labeled you as the opposite. And George Orwell, like many people of his time, was a victim of that. We got another quotation from a famous, I'm not sure whether to say Irish or English, let's say Anglo-Irish writer, Oscar Wilde, who of course was gay, and he said, I may not agree with you, but I will defend to the death your right to make an ass of yourself. I like that one. That's witty.
I hadn't heard that, but I'd heard a similar quote, I will defend to the death your right to say whatever I disagree with. Yeah. If I don't agree with you, okay, but you have the right to say what you want. Free speech.
And what's more, I want you to say it. I don't know about you, but I want to hear the opposite opinion to what I have, because I want to make sure that I know there are people who think it. But in cancel culture, they don't get the chance to say it. But maybe they represent 20% or 50% of the population, but they're just not given a chance to say it. Who wants to live in a society like that? That's not freedom of speech, is it?
No. And I think one possible problem is that whereas in the past, minority groups did not get the rights they deserve, they did not get the publicity they deserve and the equality they deserve, but maybe the pendulum is swinging too much the other way. It's swinging too much to the left. And listening to people who defend minority groups and right to do so, they get very angry when I suggest that, because they say, well, it's right that the pendulum should swing way over to the left now because it's been on the right for so long. What do you think?
Yeah, it's true. And kind of a slightly different topic, but related to what you say, I don't like the assumption of kind of old middle-aged white man as being probably racist and overprivileged. Plenty of white middle-aged men are not racist, are poor, and have had a tough life. I don't like the assumption that, oh no, you're automatically privileged. There are plenty of Asian, black, and other young multimillionaires out there. I just don't like that assumption.
What about the idea, Reza, that the staff of a company, for example, should be maybe by law or definitely by regulation, let's say 50% female, 30% Asian, 35% black, according to the percentages of society, maybe 15% Muslim. Do you think that's fair to put restrictions on how people can employ minority groups? Not restrictions on minority groups, but restrictions on how people can employ people in society, if that makes sense.
You're talking about what some people call positive discrimination.
Yes, exactly.
Meaning that they admit it's discrimination. So they say the workforce must be 50% women, whether or not you like it. I don't like it. I say the best person for the job. And if it turns out they're all men or they're all women or they're all Asian or they're all white, I don't really care. I just want the best person for the job. What about you?
Yes, I do agree with you. But then I have heard the argument that it's been for so long the other way, where most power positions have gone to white men of privilege, that now they need that restriction on employment in order to swing the pendulum back to the other side. So I think there's something there, but I don't like the idea of it being a regulation or a restriction or a law. It would just be nice if everybody was fair and nobody was racist or sexist. But it does seem very restrictive to put regulations in place to say, no, if you are going to have a ceremony like the Oscars, you must have 10% Asian, 10% black candidates, even though the films and the direction or whatever isn't that good. You have to include these minority groups because they need a voice. Yes, they need a voice. But do they have to have a voice if the work is not up to the standard of the competition?
Yeah. Let me ask you something, Craig, which will really get close to the bone here.
Put the cat amongst the pigeons, as they say.
Let's see. A lot of talk these days is given to being sensitive to minorities, particularly if they're immigrants. And here I am. I'm going to use my privilege as being the son of an immigrant to the UK. So it's quite handy for me. I have a get out of trouble card, a get out of jail card, since my father was an immigrant to the United Kingdom himself, although I was born in the United Kingdom. Craig, imagine you're speaking to foreigners and they're thinking of emigrating to a country. Let's say it's the UK. But they're not that keen on the typical kind of cultural norms or the lifestyle of the UK. And they don't really want to adapt to it or to adopt those new cultures. But they still want to emigrate to the UK because they come from Pakistan, let's say, or Bangladesh or Iran or Yemen. And they're going to live a much better life there. But they don't really want to adapt it. They're going to hang around with people of their identity, and they're not going to really get involved in the local culture. Any advice for people like that?
Well, I would use the idiom, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. If you don't like the way of living where you are, don't live there. You can't expect a whole country to change its culture just because you don't like it. So you kind of have to get used to it. And I see that happening a lot with English people who have moved to Spain. They complain when Spanish people in the service industry don't speak English. Why? It's not the language of the country. Learn Spanish if you're living here. So no, I think that's completely wrong.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it goes for any country for me. So you get people who go to the UK or the European Union countries, but they're not that keen to adopt the European cultures. But, you know, what did you expect? If I were to emigrate to Saudi Arabia, I don't expect people to suddenly start drinking pints of beer outside, in a terraza. It's just not going to happen, is it? And I better get used to the idea that I can't do it. It's as simple as that.
Let me ask you a question now, because we've spoken a little bit about fairness in the workplace, and I think we probably would agree that it's a good idea to open jobs up equally to men and women, to all races and all cultural backgrounds and classes, etc. But giving people equal opportunity in the workplace, would that necessarily lead to equal outcome? And what I mean by that is, for example, if there wasn't any sexism or racism, would we get equal men and women as nurses, for example? Would we get 50-50 men and women as engineers if the workplace was completely open and fair? My sense is, well, what do you think first before I tell you what I think?
I think it's an excellent question. And I think it depends on the job. I think for certain jobs, more or less, yes, but for others, no. You're not going to get as many males interested in being nurses as females. It's not going to happen. Doctors, 50-50, men and women, yeah, but nurses, it's not going to happen, is it?
Well, funnily enough, they did studies in Sweden and some other Scandinavian countries, and that is exactly what they found. And they found something interesting as well, that men tend to be more aggressive. So if there were equality of opportunity, which unfortunately there isn't in business, I don't think enough opportunities being given to women at the moment. It should be equal. If it were equal, there probably would still be more men in the boardroom at the head of a company because they tend to be more aggressive.
They're prepared to play harder and play dirty to get there, to do what it takes to get to the top.
And fight more. Where women are probably better in politics, although if you look at politics, there tend to be more male politicians, which is a big problem. But I think women tend to be better at negotiation, but maybe not necessarily better at being driving aggressive business practice.
Yeah. Now, one thing which I find amusing, Craig, about people who are woke, let's say, in the ironic sense. So they're very, very, very sensitive to, let's say, racism. They do not like racism, or they do not like homophobia. But sometimes they focus on one particular thing, but not everything. I find that intriguing from a psychological point of view. For example, I have met gay racists, plenty of them. And why not? I've met non-gay racists too, sure. Yeah, why not? But believe me, folks, there are plenty of gay racists out there. People who are gay, perhaps very publicly gay, but not too keen on the black folk. Or black homophobes. People who are black but don't really like the gays. Shall I go on? Sexist socialists, lesbian, anti-trans feminists. I've met quite a few of those that don't like people who were born men and want to become women. Not too keen on the idea.
But why would that surprise you? I mean, you think they should be, because they're minorities, they should share?
I didn't say it surprised me. I said I find it interesting.
Okay.
Not surprised in the least, actually, but I find it intriguing was my word. So now in these days of wokeism, there's a kind of pick and choose about what offends you. Oh, I absolutely cannot stand racism. We're all equal. Yeah. Okay, so I'm putting you in with the group of gay guys. Oh, shit. I'm with the gay guys? Oh, you don't like gays? Oh, right. Or vice versa. I find that intriguing that there are people like that these days. People who, let's be honest, tend to favor their own group. So a gay man or woman doesn't like the idea of being homophobic, but they may not be too keen on, supporting the rights of other ethnic minorities. Have you come across people like that?
Well, I can give you some examples of famous people who have been cancelled exactly because of that reason. We talked about cancel culture earlier. Well, Dave Chappelle, you may know him. He's a very famous comedian from the USA, and he was cancelled because of some transphobic jokes. And he said many, many times that he's not transphobic, but he did make jokes about the trans community, and because of that, he experienced a backlash. A backlash is a lot of criticism, and he was accused of being transphobic. And he was refused work and really put on a list of people that were not going to be employed by any major company or corporation in the media. Another example, Kevin Hart, very famous comedian. He was going to present the Oscars in 2019, but he was cancelled and that was taken away from him because he made a homophobic joke on Twitter that was silly 10 years previously. Now he's a comedian, he makes jokes for a living, and I don't think you can be a comedian and not offend somebody at some point. He apologized when he made the tweet, and he said, "I'm sorry if I offended anybody. That was not my intention." But they wanted him to apologize again 10 years later before he presented the Oscars. He refused to apologize a second time, and he did not get the Oscars. So there are some examples exactly of what you said of people from minority groups who were cancelled for criticizing other minority groups.
Yeah, and there's another case I just wanted to add because it's so well documented. The author of Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling, famously tweeted in 2019 that she supported a woman who lost her job because she said that it's not possible to change your sex. So that was interpreted as being anti-trans. And J.K. Rowling supported the woman, saying, no, it doesn't necessarily mean she's anti-trans. And the trans community really got their back up against J.K. Rowling. They haven't forgiven.
What does got their back up mean?
It got their back up. It really irritated them. They got really affected by it. And they still haven't, open speech marks, forgiven her. But I think she's unrepentant. She didn't quite apologize the way they would have liked.
Yeah. While we're on the subject of cancel culture, Will Smith famously slapped or hit with an open hand is to slap. He slapped Chris Rock, a famous black comedian, during the 2022 Oscars, and he was pretty much cancelled after that in some areas. And another example, Johnny Depp. Amber Heard alleged that he abused her, and because of the trial and the abuse hearing, he had to resign from the franchise of the Fantastic Beasts. And he's quoted as saying, "No one is safe from being cancelled these days." And there are many, many examples of not only famous people, but not so famous people losing their jobs and being victims of cancel culture. So we'd be very interested to hear what you think. What's your opinion? Do you think we've gone too far to the left? Are we being too woke in society these days? Why don't you send us a voice message and give us your opinion? You can do that by going to speakpipe.com. That's speakpipe.com/Ingles podcast. Let us know your feelings, your opinions, and we'll put your voice message in a future podcast. Reza, how can people contact us by email?
If you like, you could write to us. Write to Craig at inglespodcast.com or me, belfastreza@gmail.com.
And this podcast is sponsored in part by mansioningles.com. You can visit the online store and look at our products. Go to store.mansioningles.net.
I'd like to thank, as we do in every episode, all those people who support us through the Patreon scheme. That's Patreon, Patreon. And what those people do is they donate money. It can be as little as $1.50 per month. They donate that, and as a thank you to them, they get instant access to recent audio transcriptions. If you're interested, follow the link in the show notes. It's patreon.com/Ingles podcast.
And we don't have time to thank all of you individually for sponsoring us on Patreon, but we would like to say a special thanks to our recent Patreon supporters, and there are quite a few, I'm happy to say. Many thanks to friend of the show Erasmo Melo from Brazil. Thank you also to Raul, Antonio Gomez, Jorge Alberto Borda, Carmen Jimenez Acosta, Tomás J. Lotto, Joan Carles Grau Bermejo, Merichel, Joseph Fafo, Teresa Gil de Biedma, Jorge Juan Mañas, Justo, and special thanks to Maria Mariaga, who is donating more than the $1.50 minimum. Thank you to you and to everyone who is supporting us on Patreon. What's next week, Reza?
In next week's episode, we'll be talking about manias.
Look forward to talking about manias next week. Thank you very much for listening this week. Have a wonderful week. If you enjoyed this podcast, please tell your friends so that more people can listen. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.
The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.